All right, we are going to be talking about histograms again. Remember we talked about how histograms are a type of graph that allow us to visually represent our data. That's really our main learning target here, is that at a glance you can see right away what our class norms were, if there are any outliers, and then really compare that to your own results. Did you fit in the class norm? So you always need a frequency table. We do our intervals, and we do the amount of times you see them. I showed you this data yesterday. It's a mess, so the first thing you're going to do is reorganize it in numerical order and find your range. We know that we need to go from all the way from 10 to 21. Now what you need to do is decide how big are your intervals or are your bins. You don't want them too big because then all your data goes into one pile and you can't really tell the difference. And you don't want them too small because then you have a whole lot of those intervals. So you really want something in between. You want to aim for about 6 to 8 intervals usually. So for this one, we're going to aim for about 6. So we're going to do a bin size of 2. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your bracket, and we're going to start at 10, and we're going to do comma to 12 in parentheses. Remembering that brackets mean you include it, parentheses meaning you don't. So again, you start with a bracket 12, go to parentheses. And then even though we don't have 22, we're going to include it so that we can get 21. So now for each one, you do a tally mark. How many times there's going to be something in that bin. So 10 goes in, 12 goes to the next bin because on the parentheses. 13 also goes in there. Next bin for 14. And 15. 16 will go 1, 2, 3. All right. So now that we have our data, let's go ahead and move on. So I went ahead and put our interval table in the corner, and I drew our axes lines. So we want to title it. We're going to just title this sample data because this data doesn't really mean anything. We're going to pretend that this is a change in mass lab. And this is our frequency or our count. All right. So now we need to make those bins, and those bins look a lot like the bars. Let's start with the frequency axis. That's simply the count. We can tell that our highest one goes up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we need to make 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we can number them. Now yours are going to be perfectly spaced because you have graph paper. Please bear with me, I'm doing my best to get them spaced. And then our bottom, we're also going to have 6. So we kind of want to separate that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, then we start writing it down. So this interval, this bin, is 10 to 12. This bin is 12 to 14, and so on. All right, finally, we make the bars. So 1 here, 4, 6, 3, 2, and 1. All right. So you'll notice I tried to keep them as equal as possible. I know it's not perfect. I don't have graph paper up here on the board. But you can also tell that we kind of have a nice standard deviation of our results. It makes a nice little bell curve. So we can tell right off the bat that most of our people got a result of 14 to 16, and then the rest of them got close, maybe 1 or 2 off, and then as you get farther and farther away from 14 to 16, the numbers get less and less. But that was really easy, and our results and our data doesn't typically look like that. This is what our data typically looks like. And this is actually your data from Lab 2.1. You can see that some of you didn't follow directions for turning in your data. And that looks just like a mess. So instead, I made it more like that. What I've already done was I have sorted it all out in numerical order. Now what you need to do for change in math labs is to really make sure that you're doing the negatives all the way to 0 and then to the positives. So I have that all out there for us. And let's go ahead and make our bins and our intervals for this. Now, something we need to keep in mind is that we have some really, really big outliers here. Negative 1.88 is not like any of the other data. Same with plus 2.86. What we really want to focus on is the data that is very similar. And then we do have some that's a little bit farther, like this negative 1.5 or negative 0.10, but it still has a lot of people. So we can't really call everything like that an outlier. But we definitely do have a few. So negative 1.88, that's too far away, that's an outlier. Negative 1.19, again, too far away, that's an outlier. Negative 0.70, still an outlier. Negative 0.39, still an outlier. But negative 1.5 is not, because it's only 0.05 away from these results too, and that's a whole lot of them. So we need to include those. Then we kind of get into negative 0.02, which is really close to 0, and then all of these are really similar. Then when we get back up here, plus 0.10 is close to plus 0.17, so we're going to include all of that. But then we get to our other outliers. Plus 1.42, plus 1.88, plus 2.86, they're just too far off. And so if we were to include them into our histogram, we'd be making bin after bin after bin, and they'd all be empty, and it would really show us that those numbers are nowhere near what it needs to be. So what I want you to do right now is open your notebook to page 8, and on the bottom half, because your sample histogram should be taped to the top half, you're going to draw this histogram along with me. So in the top corner, you're going to make that interval and frequency table. If you need more room, you can always do the flap for your sample histogram, so you can draw under that as well. And you're going to follow along this histogram with me. So we mentioned already that we have a lot of outliers. So we don't want to include those outliers. So we're going to make an interval like that. From then on, we're going to start right here, negative 0.15, and we're going to go all the way to plus 0.17 and stop. So a good bin size is 0.05. That allows us to not have too many bins, but to still separate our data. So our first bin, you're going to put a bracket, negative 0.15. And I want you to put commas instead of dash marks, because when we deal with change in mass or any kind of negative number, it's really, really confusing if you have dashes, because then you'd have a dash minus and just use a comma instead. It's much easier. So, and then a negative 0.10 parentheses. Because of the parentheses, you do it again. This one we're just going to 0. All right, now we're starting the positive numbers. I know you don't usually put a plus sign for positive. I'm going to, just so we can stay clear today. But if you don't want to, that's fine. You do need to include the negative sign, of course, though. And finally, we're going to do another outlier going the opposite way. Okay? So let's go ahead and do our tally marks. So for our outliers, we're going to include 4. Okay, and then for negative 0.15, we have 2. We cannot include negative 0.10 because it's not in parentheses. We're going to include that in the next one. So that's 1, 2 for that one. And we've got a lot for this one. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up until 0. We don't want to include 0. Zeros, we got 1, 2, 3, 4. And then 5, 6, 7, 8. That's part C. 9, 10, 11. That's a big bin size. Okay? For values that are more than 0.05, we don't have any for that bin size. And it's okay to leave it blank. You just don't want to have a lot of blank bin sizes. Then we get to plus 0.10 and plus 0.17. And then we have 1, 2, 3 outliers. All right. So this is on the next slide as well, so don't worry if you don't have everything down, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. All right, so a little bit neater. We can see that we have all the intervals and frequency. All right, so now we have a histogram. Again, I want you to be doing this along with me, so I should see your frequency table on page 38, either under the sample histogram or at the bottom. So I've already kind of marked our bins down here so they'd be a little bit more even. I need you to do that as well. It should take up most of that page at the bottom. So you might want to do about 2 to 3 boxes, and they all need to be even. So do make sure you count it out. We have 9 intervals total, so you need to have 9 spaces. Okay, our highest one here is 11, so we're going to go ahead and tally that for us. Again, that needs to be even as well. Okay, and then you just simply write in your intervals. So this one would be our outlier, and then and as you can see, I'm running out of room. So sometimes, especially on your graph, there's not a lot of space. So I kind of write out a diagonal then. And that gives you plenty of space. You should be doing this along with me. And then we have our outlier error right there. All right, this is how yours should look when you're done. You should notice that we put the bars right next to each other. We don't leave any space in between. At this point, you should have a completed histogram on page 38. I've also drawn one in my notebook that I've left with a substitute that you guys are welcome to look at. Please make sure that everything is labeled. If you need additional time, you saw that this is linked to the homework PowerPoint, so you can watch it again if necessary.